Welcome back, grade 6. Today we are working on chapter 3, data management, and this is the getting started, the intro to the unit. So we'll do a little bit of review today, and here are our goals for chapter 3. We're going to collect, organize, and analyze the results of a survey, make bar graphs, line graphs, and scatter plots. Each of those three different types of graphs has a different purpose. Use mean and median to compare sets of data. Describe how changing the scale or interval size affects the appearance of a graph. Use data to make arguments. So there are a few terms here I'm going to ask you to pay very close attention to when they come up. I'm also going to ask you to pay close attention in our society when you hear these words and see if they're being used properly. Sometimes they are being used properly, but they're intentionally being misguided towards what they're trying to get you, the viewer, to see. And sometimes these terms are being misused. So, for example, when we think of a survey, any survey, think about who is making the survey and why they're making that survey. We are going to analyze. You've been collecting and organizing the data for many years, since kindergarten, really. However, we're going to now make more of an effort to analyze them. Bar graphs, line graphs, and scatter plots. While all of them use numbers and some sort of lines, they do not all serve the same purpose. They are definitely different types of graphs. We can make multiple different types of graphs with the same data. It just depends what we want to show. And we're going to be spending time talking about that too. The mean and the median, when you hear that, please make careful note of what it's being used for. Often we use the word average to signify the word mean. However, average could be mean or median, and that term is often, I don't want to say it's misused because it's become part of our everyday vocabulary, but mathematically it's being misused. So when we say average, it could mean any number that tends to be in the middle of our set of data. Mean and median, however, find that middle differently. We're also going to be looking at how changing the scale and changing the intervals change our graph appearance and why people may want to do that. We're also going to be using data to make arguments. So please, while we are doing this unit and while you are in our society watching the news or reading stories, listening to radio, whatever the case may be, please pay attention to where you hear these different terms being used. Moving on now to review. Number 1, for a project on climate, Ethan researched the times of sunrise and sunset on the first day of each month in Edmonton. He used these times to calculate the number of daylight hours on those days and made a broken line graph. Along the top in this chart, we see the months, and in the bottom part of the chart, we see the number of daylight hours. It says complete the graph using the data in the table, and then describe any trend you see in the graph. We're going to fill in the rest of this graph after August, starting now. So I filled in the rest of the dots with my oversized red dot here, put a broken line through it, so I've completed the broken line graph. These intervals here, they go up by 2. So for example, with the 11.5, we had to make sure that we put this dot for October. We had to make sure we put the dot not quite at the 12, but it can't be in the middle of the 10 and the 12 either. That would have been an 11. So here we have all of our dots, which in our broken line graph, which we would expect to see. The trends we see how the number of daylight hours rises until July, which we would expect to see because the longest day of the year, or the day with the greatest number of hours, is June 20th or June 21st, the start of summer. And it continues to go down all the way until December, January, when we see 8 or 7.5 hours of daylight. This trend would continue. So if we were to extend, not just for this year, but we went back many, many years, we would see this line go starting to rise until approximately June or July, and then it would go down, and then it would go back up again, and we would see it would look like a wave. So that's the trend that we see here. We typically see about 1.5 hours, typically 1.5 to 2 hours of increase in daylight on average every single month. That's one more trend. Number two, Emma had 20 students in her class record the number of spam email messages they received one day. A. Organize her data in a tally chart with intervals. B. Emma plans to use the tally chart to make a bar graph with intervals. Describe how you think the bar graph will look. So I did make one example of intervals. Here's my tally chart. And the tally here indicates that we have, or my choices, is we have an interval of 1 to 10, 11 to 20, and so on, all the way down in intervals of 10 until 70. And my tallies look like this. This was one option that we could have done. However, the other option would have been making this kind of a graph. This graph might also be just as valid. The reason I made a different chart here with a different set of intervals is so I could show you how this would look different if instead of making intervals of 10, I made intervals of 20, 1 to 20, 21 to 40, and downward all the way up to 80. So you can see that if I chose this, a lot of my data would be in my 1 to 20. So the 1 to 20 bar would be very, very high in our bar graph. By splitting it up like this, sometimes it's the better choice, and sometimes it's not the better choice. Ideally, we want to see some kind of spread where the data is, so we can draw conclusions about that data. So for part B, she plans to use a tally chart to make a bar graph with intervals. Doesn't matter which one we choose, we're going to get a lot of the data in the left side of the graph with the number of spam messages less than 20. We see that in both. So if we take the 1 to 10 and the 11 to 20, most of our data is right there. Most of our data in this tally chart is from the 11 to 20, whereas most of our data in the interval of 20 tally chart lies in the first interval. Both are definitely valid, but having this one allows us to see that most of the people in the class, and our bar graph would show us this as well, that most of the people in the class get between 11 and 20 spam messages received in one day. This bar graph right here would have 7 bars. This one would have 4, because this is how I've chosen to display the data. Of course, with a bar graph, you still must have a title, a horizontal axis, a vertical axis, and they must be labeled, and a scale along the left side. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.